Hi folks, and welcome back to Conveyancing. This is the video series for Contract to Settlement, and we are up to part 2 of the video series. In this part we will be looking at settlement matters. In particular, we will be looking at paper settlement, e-conveyancing, possession, and also the doctrine of merger. So looking first at paper settlement. What is settlement in an overall sense? It is where there is a complete conveyance from one party to the other. So as you can see there, my little diagram, I've got the rather smug looking seller with the rather unhappy wife transferring over with their transfer form to the rather happy buyer who's handing over her money. Settlement is the milestone when title is given and accepted, and we'll be having a look at that a little bit more when we're talking about the doctrine of merger. From that time on, the buyer waives the right to object to defects in title. Clause 5.3 of the standard terms for the houses and land contract talks about settlement in the more traditional sense. So it speaks of payment on settlement date in exchange for the transferred documents and instruments to release encumbrances. And underneath the little man there, you'll see I've got a release of mortgage. Also, this is the time for a handover of keys if they have been requested with sufficient time. If there's any leases that relate to the property, then you're going to have to deliver up the tenancy documents as well. So that is your traditional paper settlement. You'll have the parties gathering around the table at the appointed place for settlement at the appointed time, hopefully. And you will have the exchanges being made in the physical sense. Tender of settlement, obviously, is what is done by the parties as part of their performance of the obligations. Now, in your contract law unit, you would have discussed the issue of tendering performance and whether your obligations were independent or dependent and concurrent. In a settlement of a real property transaction, the obligations of the seller and the purchaser are dependent and concurrent, so they are both dependent on each other. The purchaser has to offer up their payment and the seller has to offer up the transfer. Obviously, each party has to be ready, willing and able to complete on settlement date. If one party fails to tender their performance at settlement, the other party can't terminate unless they are ready, willing and able to settle themselves. And you might remember from your contract law days, we discuss the old case of Foreign and White, which was where the seller was having trouble registering their right of way prior to the date of settlement. They let the purchasers know that they were having these difficulties. The purchasers didn't terminate right there and then for anticipatory breach. They let the settlement date go past and then they terminated. That then prompted the sellers to object to the termination on the basis that the purchasers themselves were not ready, willing and able because they didn't attend settlement themselves either. In that case, the court held that the purchasers had validly terminated. At the point they didn't have to attend settlement and tender their performance on the settlement date, where to do so had been plainly indicated by the sellers would be futile. So no need to actually go ahead and tender performance where it's just going to be useless or futile, and you can rely on the other party's intimation that settlement won't occur. Now, at settlement, obviously, each party is going to want to know that the other party or their representative have the right authority to be able to give or receive a good discharge for the other party's performance of their obligations, their tender of performance. At common law, interestingly, a solicitor does not have authority to give or receive a discharge of the obligation to pay, and you're going to need written authority to accept purchase money. However, that common law situation is abrogated somewhat by Section 66 of the Property Law Act, which empowers a solicitor to give and receive a discharge of the obligation to pay. So you're all good there. However, 66 itself is kind of rendered nugatory by clause 2.5 sub 1 of the REIQ standard terms in the house and land contract. And you'll see I've got it down there on the left hand side. On the settlement date, buyer has to pay as the seller or the seller's solicitor directs. So you have express contractual authority there for the seller's solicitor to go ahead and direct as to disbursement of funds. The text does say, out of caution, if you're not using the REIQ terms, then the buyer should get a written direction from the seller or their solicitor to disperse the funds at settlement. What about payment? Can you offer coins? Can you offer notes? Do you need to offer a bank check as part of tendering your performance as buyer? You can see there, section down the bottom in the middle, section 61 sub 2 sub A of the Property Law Act says that payment or tender can be made by a financial institution check drawn on either itself or drawn on a bank. That situation is modified by 2.5 sub 2 sub B. You can see down the bottom of the left there, despite any other provision of this contract, a reference to bank check, so you can pay by bank check. Reference to bank check in clause 2.5 does not include a check drawn by a building society or credit union on a bank. So you can pay by a check drawn on a building society or a credit union that draws on itself, but you can't have a check from a building society or credit union that's drawn on a bank. And so in terms of the seller accepting payment as part of the buyer's tender of performance, bank checks will usually be the go, and under the REIQ standard terms, building society and credit union checks are okay as long as they are not drawn on a bank. They need to be drawn on themselves. So, okay, the seller is not obliged to accept a check other than those. So that is the tender of your performance as a buyer. I have shown you all of the paper forms before, but just looking at them once again, there you have your Form 1 transfer, your Form 24 property information there, and the Form 25, which deals with foreign ownership information. So that is the issue of your more traditional paper version of settlement. What about e-conveyancing? Now you'll see on the right hand side there I've got big PEXA logo because they are pretty much the monopoly interest as an ELNO, electronic lodgement network operator. In fact, they have just recently drawn the ire of the ACCC for their monopoly status pretty much. The two underdogs are Simply, that's run by the ASX, and LexTech, which is run by Purcell Partners, both trying madly to get into what is a very lucrative game that PEXA is pretty much running at the moment. What about the obligations of the seller and buyer in an electronic settlement? They are still dependent and concurrent obligations to tender performance. However, there's no physical act of tendering, obviously, because it's done electronically. But the buyer actually has to cooperate with the seller by digitally signing the transfer document in the workspace. And if they don't, they can hamper the seller's ability to fulfill their obligation to deliver up a transfer capable of registration. So they can actually get in the way of the seller actually being able to deliver good title. If that's the case, fairly clearly the buyer is going to be in breach. So they can't just fail to sign and therefore force the seller into breach there. The buyer in that kind of circumstance would themselves be in breach. Electronic conveyancing obviously relies on a lot of different computer systems: PEXA, Land Registry, Reserve Bank, the Office of State Revenue, cast of thousands really, and they all need to be able to work together to get the job done, so to speak. However, there are contractual provisions that allow for some contingencies if the relevant systems are down when the crucial time arrives, and that's kind of fleshed out in the text, so I'll leave you to discover that for yourselves. In terms of electronic conveyancing, clause 5.3 and also clause 11 are operative here. 5.3 is the clause that we were just talking about, the main clause that deals with the parties' obligations at settlement and what has to be handed over. Under the electronic settlement framework in the REIQ standard contract, the buyer will be deemed to comply with their obligation to pay by cheque if they pay via PEXA, and under 11.3, the seller is deemed to comply with the obligation to deliver up title and good transfer if it completes and signs the e-transfer in Form 24 and any release of mortgage in the workspace prior to settlement. If there are documents or other things that are not suitable for electronic lodgement, then the seller has to confirm they hold them. They have to undertake to send them to the buyer no later than the business day after settlement. And if a canny buyer requests copies of the documents held by the seller solicitors, then they can request them, and the seller has to go ahead and provide copies of those. I'm not going to labour the whole issue of electronic settlement. The text covers the legalities of electronic settlement quite well. You can go and have a look at those clauses in the contract that I've pointed out to you. And also there are some fairly decent resources that have been put out by PEXA, including a couple of videos that step you through a conveyance when you're acting for a vendor and a conveyance when you're acting for a purchaser. And I've put those resources on Moodle for you. I've linked them there, so you can go and explore those at your leisure. So that is electronic settlement, and that is e-conveyancing. And we've reached our convenient halfway point for this video series, so I'll end video 3 here, and I'll catch you all again in video 4. Thanks guys, bye for now.